Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Jesuits in the United States, A Concise History by David J. Collins, S.J. Narrated by David Stifel. Preface. The founder of the Jesuit order, St. Ignatius Loyola, wrote into the Constitutions, its primary governing document, "Our vocation is to travel through the world and to live in any part of it where there is hope of greater service to God and of help of souls." One corner of the world where its members have traveled, lived, and aspired to these lofty goals for nearly 5 centuries and to the present day is North America. This book is about those Jesuits. Though about Jesuits, this is a book for all kinds of people. It is a book for people who have heard something about Jesuits, good, bad, or neutral, but are not sure exactly what a Jesuit is. It is a book for those who know a Jesuit or of a Jesuit and want to know more about the organization of which he is a part and to which he has dedicated his life. It is a look at the Jesuits for folks who think that history can offer insights into the present. Those listeners and aims are what inspired this book, which started as notes for an introductory workshop for people who knew something about contemporary Jesuits but wanted to understand them better through their history. This book does not tell the whole history of the Society of Jesus, as the Jesuit organization is formally named, but focuses on the Jesuits active in the United States. Along these lines, the book will also be of interest to those who have no immediate curiosity about Jesuits, but are curious about religion in America. On this point, I am reminded of something a professor of religious history told a group of us undergraduates in his class on American Catholicism 40 years ago. The history of America cannot be told without the history of religion. The history of American religion cannot be told without the history of Catholicism, and the history of Catholicism in America cannot be told without the history of Jesuits in America. And so, this book. Before I offer an introduction, chapter by chapter of this book, I need to alert the listener to a couple of challenges I faced as I wrote. The listener may have noticed a hint of the first challenge in the differences between the book's title and its topic as expressed in the last paragraph. The former speaks of Jesuits in the United States, the latter of Jesuits in America. These terms are, of course, not identical. The United States is but one part even of North America. Furthermore, the national history of the United States is only half the nearly 5 centuries that this book covers. Maybe the problem could be dismissed as a technicality. But hidden in the incongruities is actually something quite noteworthy. Centuries before the United States came into existence, extensive Jesuit activity was underway in the Americas, and this activity in the colonial period laid important groundwork for the order's later activity in the United States proper. On top of that, no Jesuit regional history ever unfolds in isolation from the rest of Jesuit history. Ever since Francis Xavier, 1506–52, departed Lisbon for Goa in 1541, Jesuit activity has been global. The history of Jesuits in America is part of this global activity, and there have been geopolitical dimensions to the history from the beginning. Jesuits started arriving in the Americas in the 16th century only at the indulgence of Europe's colonizing crowned heads. The Jesuits who served in these colonies came from across Europe. Because the colonialized territories in those times do not match up with national boundaries today, in the earlier chapters we keep in our field of view mainly the North American continent north and east of the Rio Grande. In later chapters, we narrow the focus to Jesuits in the United States itself. But even then, 19th century French missions extending down from Canada and up from New Orleans, recurrent waves of refugee Jesuits from various parts of Europe, A porous frontier between the Jesuit United States and Jesuit Canada, and the presence of U.S. Jesuits in foreign missionary territories in the 20th century always make the history more than just a national one. What at first glance seems an inconvenience of language, how to identify the geographical and chronological scope of this volume, in fact sets the stage for a transnational history in a country that itself is a singularly diverse modern multiculture. The range of Jesuit activities is at the heart of the second challenge. Over those 4.5 centuries, the variety has been extraordinary, and the Jesuits themselves comprise a rich, colorful assortment of talents and temperaments. Furthermore, there has been little that the Jesuits have succeeded or failed at on their own. Colleagues and co-workers, donors and patrons, students and alumni, parishioners, fellow religious men and women, priests and bishops, state legislatures and tribal councils, legislators and chiefs, tenant farmers and enslaved people. The list goes on and on. All made the Jesuit history possible. The challenge in a book like this is to form into an intelligible storyline a complex regional history that captures as much as possible of the who, the what, the how, and the why of this massive Jesuit enterprise. And yes, as a concise history in under 50,000 words. To achieve these goals, the book pays closest attention to the Jesuits themselves, as individuals and a group. Institutions like schools and organizational structures like missions are favored in this volume for several reasons. Among them, because sources are accessible and abundant, because so many Jesuits can be accounted for in this way, and because so many other people are at least implicitly included, especially through educational institutions. In the end, this book does not aspire to be the definitive history of the Jesuits in the United States, but rather to whet the listener's appetite for more. Introduction. Laying Foundations. This book is divided into 5 chapters. Though the chapters are arranged chronologically, there is always some spillage forward or backward because trends in Jesuit history, as in all history, rarely reach moments of absolute transition or culmination. Usually what binds each chapter is some distinctive intersection of what the Jesuits were doing, what American Catholics looked like, and where Catholics fit in larger U.S. society. The particulars of these 3 components were, and are, always shifting. 2 threads run through the whole history, sometimes intersecting, always changing relative to each other, and never completely isolated from each other. The first one has to do with Jesuit contact and work with Native Americans. The second, with European settlers, immigrants, and these legacy populations to the present day. That at the end of the 20th century, activities connected to the former are so diminished by many measures, number of mission stations, amount of dedicated manpower, and so on, and in comparison with any earlier point in Jesuit history, should not distract the listener from the enormous significance of that work for the Jesuits throughout their history in Upper North America. The possibilities associated with the indigenous populations attracted hundreds of European Jesuits to the Americas, and still today inspire the life work of many Jesuits. This history was complicated as it played out, and is complicated as it is looked back on today, ever more so in the present moment. As this book goes to press, the history of settlers' treatment of native peoples is coming under new scrutiny. That is a good thing. It will mean that the assessment of Jesuit cooperation with colonial, state, and national governments in their treatment of native peoples will change, as also the Church's pursuit of its Great Commission to make disciples of and baptize all nations. This book tries to capture the current state of scholarship, but the listener should be alerted to how quickly it is changing. The other thread, the one having to do with the settler population and its descendants, is this. The Jesuits have been committed to the ideal that Catholics could make a home in, be integrated in, thrive in, and productively shape mainstream American society. This ideal can be contrasted to an alternate ideal that looks to the creation of a Catholic community, situated in but insulated from the greater American society. Both modes of being American have been prominent ways of pursuing the American dream. Indeed, a spectrum can be drawn that places the American melting pot achieved by a strategy of mainstreaming at one end and the American salad bowl achieved by a strategy of ghettoizing at the other. How mainstreaming and ghettoizing happen along these lines to any one group has as much to do with forces internal to a community as external to it. And self-segregation and imposed segregation reinforce each other, community by community, in an infinite range of ways. To offer two quite different examples of isolating communities, think of the old order Amish in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and of 20th century gay communities in the Castro district and Greenwich Village. Though many people throughout history have preferred, and do prefer, the ghettoized model for Catholicism, some of them Catholics themselves, the Jesuits' contribution to Catholicism in America has been decidedly on the mainstreaming side of the spectrum. We will return to such overarching themes in the epilogue. In the meantime, we must start with a story that begins in 1566. In Chapter 1, we explore Jesuit activities in colonial North America, which piggybacked on three European colonizing powers, the Spanish, the French, and the English, in their attempts to establish a foothold in North America. Each had failures before it had successes, and only the latter two succeeded on the North Atlantic coast. Spanish Jesuits ultimately reoriented themselves from Florida to Mexico. French Jesuits, after several failed attempts at the beginning of the 16th century, finally in the 1630s got a foothold in Quebec City, from which to launch their work throughout New France. Unlike in New Spain and New France, in the English colony of Maryland, Catholics were a small minority of colonists, but were among the social elite. This was an odd situation. In England and its colonies, legal prejudice against and social hostility toward Catholicism were a serious threat, which in Maryland waxed and waned until independence. Jesuits arrived with the Catholics at the invitation of the Catholic proprietor in 1634. The history of these colonial Jesuits is a history of how they and the small Catholic community to which they ministered negotiated this unusual and unstable situation. Chapter 2 explores what happened when the papacy first dissolved and then restored the order. The reasons for the suppression are complex, and beyond the scope and capacity of this small volume. A thumbnail sketch would begin with one pope's letter in 1773 that suppressed the order, and a later pope's decree that restored it in 1814. When we look more closely, however, we see that the story is not nearly so simple and is much more interesting. On one hand, royal suppressions in Spain and France anticipated the papal one. On the other hand, a small remnant of Jesuits remained active in Russia, where Empress Catherine the Great prohibited the implementation of the original papal letter. Furthermore, while the Catholic hierarchy enforced the suppression in the English colonies, its effects were different from those anywhere else in the world, both for the suddenly former Jesuits and for the Church. In 1773, the only priests in the 13 colonies were Jesuits, and there had never been a local bishop to guide the Church, only the order's religious superiors. What emerged from this disorder was remarkable. A national church, with a bishop eventually, and local clergy who were not Jesuits, though many had been. By the time the society was restored in the United States, there was a small but vibrant church at last in place. The Jesuits would become a crucial part of this, but the order was no longer the driving force behind it, as it had been before. One twist in the remarkable story is that the suppression ended in the United States not with the Papal Bull of 1814, but nearly a decade earlier, with the affiliation of a few former Jesuits with the order's remnant in Russia. Like so much else that is recounted in this chapter, this restoration was due to the tireless efforts and patient diplomacy of the nation's first bishop, John Carroll, himself a former Jesuit. This chapter also devotes itself to a sketch of the sad history of Jesuit slaveholding. Enslaved people were a kind of property the Jesuits claimed in the colonial period, lost at the suppression, fought to regain with the Restoration, and benefited from until the end of the Civil War. The 19th century, taken as a whole, was a period of great expansion for the Jesuits, the Church, and the country as a whole. For the Jesuits, as for the nation, the growth in membership had a lot to do with immigration. Because of aggressive anti-clerical laws and revolutions at home, hundreds of European Jesuits arrived in the 19th century as refugees, and some European provinces made commitments to relocate to the United States. These Jesuits tended also to arrive in waves by nation of origin, and then to settle in and take responsibility over specific regions of the United States and its western territories. Chapter 3 follows these waves and concentrates in turn on the Belgian Jesuits as they landed in St. Louis and spread across the Midwest and Great Plains, the Italians as they moved to the Rockies, into the Pacific Northwest and into California, the French as they returned to a corridor stretching from Quebec to New Orleans and expanded into New York, and the Germans as they spread across the Great Lakes region and worked their way into the Indian Territory of the Great Plains. Sometimes it looks as if these emergent missions maintained stronger relations with their home provinces than with their Jesuit neighbors in North America, but much of what they were actually doing was quite similar. These were brick-and-mortar years for the Church as a whole, and for the Jesuits in particular, who, often at the invitation of local bishops, arrived in new cities and established a full range of works centered on a school and a parish. Similar strategies were being followed in their missions to the Native Americans. These common works and the inevitable exchange of personnel encouraged networks across these ethnic and geographical divides. The clearest signal of this integration came in the opening years of the next century, when Rome uncoupled these provinces and missions from their European mother provinces and linked them administratively to one another to encourage yet more cooperation and coordination in the efforts already happening across the United States. As the Church continued to grow in the early 20th century, the significance of the new waves of Catholic immigrants was matched by the increasing size of Catholic families, with several generations already in the country. A notable demographic shift within the Jesuits followed this development. The flow of refugee personnel waned, but was more than made up for in homegrown recruits. Here is where Chapter 4 begins. The Jesuits continued developing the infrastructure they had begun in the previous century, especially the schools, and developed new ministries in the service of a Catholic population that was a substantial and growing proportion of American labor, and also making inroads into business. National and international worries over communism drove Jesuit outreach to both groups, and their strategy attempted to encompass both popular and scholarly modes of addressing what was known as the social question. Under the direction of the Chicago-born Jesuit Daniel Lord, the Sodality of Our Lady, whose origins echoed the earliest efforts of the order at the Catholic renewal in 16th-century Europe, annually gathered hundreds of thousands of Catholic young people to encourage a new Catholic activism in the American public sphere. Simultaneously, the order was founding think tanks and policy institutes, the so-called Institutes of Social Order, and committing younger Jesuits to the advanced study of the social sciences as well. Both the Church and the order were coming into their own in a country that viewed Catholicism skeptically, but that was coming to see the Church's growth as contributing to the nation's own best interests. Chapter 5 attempts to capture the late 20th century history of the order by highlighting two very different sets of forces shaping church and society, sometimes in coordination, sometimes at cross purposes. The first set is the theological ideals that came to powerful expression at the Second Vatican Council, 1961-64, and for the Jesuits in particular in a pair of general congregations, its highest governing body, that took place in 1964-65 and 1974-75. The second set comprises social forces, moving believers and unbelievers alike toward greater senses of autonomy from and skepticism toward religion and other traditional authority. Two factors consequently dominated Jesuit life and work: a renewal of their spirituality and a diminishment in their numbers. These factors, more than any others in this period, shaped how Jesuits thought about themselves and how they, sometimes inspired by new ideals, sometimes forced out of necessity by their shrinking membership, related to their works and institutions, the laity and the hierarchy, and broader society. These factors continue to do so, making conclusions all the more difficult to draw. Many significant events could be pointed to as marking the beginning of the 21st century in important ways for the U.S. Jesuits. None of them seems adequate, even that most remarkable of them, the election of a South American Jesuit as Pope. Nonetheless, the epilogue provides the opportunity to consider the strongest threads to be found in the preceding 5 chapters, and to speculate about how these may be found in the present and hint at a future. In the final analysis, such ruminations belong not to historians, but to their readers. Chapter 1. Colonies, 1566 to 1773. Jesuits have been active in Upper North America, the territory roughly corresponding to today's United States and Canada, since the mid-16th century. For the first 3/4 of this history, their activity was largely a European enterprise. Most Jesuits were European-born, and most people they served, even given the attraction of and a commitment to the Native American missions, were of European origin and descent. A vexing question throughout this period was what it meant to become American, and how that should shape what the Jesuits should do, whether working in a burgeoning port town with European immigrants or in the Rocky Mountains with Native Americans. In these respects, the story of the Jesuits in the United States is a classically American one, which starts with the colonial powers that brought the Jesuits to the Americas in the first place. The 3 colonizing empires critical to the early history of the Jesuits are the Spanish, the French, and the British. With them we begin. New Spain. Nearly a half-century before English or French Jesuits ever found a foothold in Upper North America, Jesuits in concert with the Spanish crown were making modest, short-lived efforts at establishing a mission on the North American Atlantic coast. Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, the explorer who founded St. Augustine in La Florida, invited Jesuits to come and Christianize the native peoples there in 1566. At the time, La Florida constituted a vice province of the Jesuit province of Peru. Because of perceived royal ambivalence to expansion in La Florida, The mission superior, Juan Bautista de Segura, circa 1530 to 71. Note that these birth and death dates in parentheses at a person's first mention indicate membership in the Jesuit order. The initials S.J. are generally not appended to the name. Left indicates the year of canonical separation from the society, whether voluntary or involuntary. Decided to suppress the mission in San Agustin and return the bulk of the community to Havana, but also to explore possibilities to the north himself with several companions. That contingent traveled up the coast as far as the Bahia de Madre de Dios, the Chesapeake Bay, and attempted to found a mission, the Ahacan, in September 1570, somewhere near the mouth of what the English later named the York River. 5 months later, a lone survivor returned to San Agustin, telling of an assault by native people that put an end not just to the fledgling mission, but to Jesuit efforts in La Florida and to the north altogether. The remaining Jesuits in Havana wrote to the head of the order in Rome, Francis Borgia, 1510 to 72, advising that men be sent elsewhere. Borgia received that caution simultaneously with a new request from the King of Spain. Philip II wanted Jesuits in Mexico. By 1571, Philip's authority extended over Spain and its New World Empire, as well as over Naples, Sicily, and the Netherlands. He was keenly interested in the activities of the Church throughout his realm, and his ecclesiastical involvement ranged from the generous endowments of churches and religious houses to intrusive interventions into parish and monastic life. Concerned for maintaining both religious orthodoxy and loyalty to the crown, Philip superintended the assignment of Spanish priests outside Spain and of foreign priests to the colonial missions. The king's sudden interest in recruiting Jesuits to Mexico not only corresponded to the Jesuits' new missionary verve, but given the order's dependence on princely cooperation for its initiatives, whether at home and abroad, was also the kind of offer they could not refuse. The Mexico mission quickly proved itself exactly as the mission in Florida had not, a success. Jesuits arrived in Mexico City on September 28, 1572. From this staging point, the Jesuit mission expanded steadily into Upper North America. In the mid-18th century, the mission in the Sonoran Desert, an area that now straddles the U.S.-Mexican frontier, included over 30 churches and encompassed nearly 100 villages. The mission's purpose was the evangelization of local peoples and their protection from the crassest forms of Spanish exploitation, even as it led ineluctably to their submission to colonial control. The Crown's expulsion of the Jesuits from New Spain in 1767 terminated their mission activities there. The Franciscan friars took over existing missions in the Sonoran Desert. The expulsion also ended ambitious Jesuit plans to expand from Baja into Alta California. The Dominican friars were assigned the Jesuit establishments in Baja California, and the Franciscans stepped in to found 21 missions between 1769 and 1823, from San Diego to Sonoma. When a century later the Jesuits returned to the region, European immigrant and Hispanic populations in cities were the focus of their attention, rather than native ones. In short, the colonial Spanish mission to native populations in the American Southwest flourished as long as it lasted, was handed over to others by necessity, and was not returned to when the Italian Jesuits returned to the region a century later. New France. A second effort at settling on the North American East Coast began in 1611, when Jesuits landed at Penobscot Bay, then in New France and now in Maine. The French efforts began with little more success than the earlier Spanish efforts in La Florida. The French Jesuits shared the Spaniards' earlier goal of evangelizing indigenous peoples, but sustained contact proved elusive.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?